So tonight we have a webinar on company culture and consulting with Paul Taylor. It's a very interesting topic. I've spent a lot of time as a management consultant dealing with IT teams of various types, and I never cease to be surprised how little they appreciate the need to understand culture and to get involved in the cultural aspects of being successful in your endeavours. So a very interesting topic altogether. And Paul himself, of course, has a lot of experience in the field. He's been a consultant for over 30 years, implementing change across a whole range of different sectors: financial services, oil, gas, charities, professional bodies. And he's written and spoken on a variety of subjects such as change management, freelancing, technology, financial services, and research approaches. He's a chair and an NED for a variety of industry and social enterprises, covering gambling addiction, that's an interesting area, performing arts, another interesting area, particularly for the BAME community. And finally, he's an associate lecturer for the Open University STEM school teaching technology management. So a lot of very valid experience, and it's going to be a very interesting session tonight. So I think at that stage I should stop sharing my screen and hand over to you, Paul.
Let's get cracking. So welcome everybody. Hopefully you can see this, the slide at the top, nice picture of me in the corner, which is taken many years ago now. My hair is probably the same colour as my shirt as it is there now. So today's, as Simon very nicely said, today is about company culture and consulting. Whoops. And I've got a few slides on myself there. I won't even go through that because I can't do the justice Simon did for me. So moving on to the main agenda really. So whoops, start again. So what I'm looking to do is the first one is sort of discuss initially why culture is so important for consultants. It is one of those areas that people, including myself, have forgotten, and it's a key area. But before we dive into that, the most important thing is to understand what exactly is culture. And this is a slightly subjective point of view, from my point of view. Culture is obviously, a lot of people define it differently, but I think I've come up with a definition that sort of like seems to tick all the boxes. Once we go on to item 2, we go down to item 3 is how do cultures grow and develop? Obviously cultures, you don't go and buy it, you don't go and grow one off the shelf, you don't go and buy a culture from the supplier in the same way you can buy a piece of technology or something else. It's something that grows through organisation over time. And then once we sort of like discuss how you can grow a culture, I want to talk through how it can actually shape an organisation. You know, there's all these great phrases. Companies have a good culture. Companies have a bad culture. Somebody comes have an aggressive culture, and really it's just around there sort of like discussing how it shapes it. And then probably the bulk of the presentation will be number 5 is basically how to define or measure, or really how to define, measure, or understand what a culture is. So it's a number of hints and tips and ideas on, you know, what things you need to look about what a culture is. And then before we sort of move into the wrap up at number 8, number 6 looks at how to change an organisation's culture. Again, it's very hard, it's challenging, but it's doable. Organisations do change cultures. I've worked at places and worked on culture change, and it can be done. It's not easy, but hopefully these hints and tips will give you a steer. Then we'll look at 2 case studies. They are anonymised, but they are based on real experiences I've worked on. I'll probably have to speak quite anonymous about them because as soon as I mention a few points, anybody who's worked at these 2 places where the 2 case studies are will actually know what they are. So if we get on to the very first one, why is culture so important for consultants? Without stating the obvious, all cultures, organisations have their own culture. But the key thing to mention, different locations, different different offices, could have their own subcultures. So while an organisation will say it's got a certain type of culture, if you can imagine, there's a lot of subcultures. In the same way, different countries have different cultures, you know, so you could be working for a multinational firm. The UK culture from the firm is very different, say, from the Irish firm or the German subsidiary or the Australian subsidiary. Different industries have different ways of working again. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of subcultures within different organisations. If you can imagine, it's a sort of like a big Venn diagram of stuff. culture defines how the organisation operates and how things are done, or often, if you're trying to do change management consultancy, what stops things getting not done. Therefore, without stating the obvious, this means that for a consultant, or anyone, to be fair, who wants to work in an organisation, you need to be able to understand what an organisation's culture is, how it operates, what the almost like trying to understand sort of like the maps on how it works. Because, you know, if you've got to deliver an assignment, the better you understand the culture, the better you can actually maximise the chance or the likelihood of you delivering an assignment successfully. And remember, it's as an old boss of mine said, he said it's like swimming against the tide. If you're trying to work against the culture, and it's very hard work. And sometimes it's easier to just go with the flow almost and work with the culture. And it's also hard to change a culture. But again, hopefully the hints and tips later on this slide, on this pack, will help you do it. So therefore, we've talked about why culture is so important for consultants, i.e., you know, to work in a firm, you need to really, really understand what the culture is. Sorry, my screen's just gone a bit weird. That's better. So basically, I think the next thing is just to work through exactly what a culture is. Again, it's a phrase that's used a lot. It's misquoted, and people use a lot of these things. They will use it for the state, to back their own opinions. Those are, I assume most of you guys and ladies on the call UK based. There's lots of stuff with the Tory government talking about a culture of disobedience and not helping during the civil service to make the Tory government sound better. But again, the most important thing is it's almost a step back and have a look at what a culture is. So unfortunately, it's very hard to define a culture in a clear, tangible way. Often people try and label cultures into a box, say like the firm is a tough guy firm, the firm is passive, the firm is rapid, but this can be very misleading. So therefore what I've defined it is, and I probably stole this off the internet many months ago when I was preparing for this with Antonio, is a combination of shared beliefs and values established by his leadership determine how the organisation does things. And the key point there is how the organisation does things. So if you want to get the organisation to do something for you, i.e. complete your assignment, then you need to understand how it works. The culture itself is reinforced by actions and behaviours in the organisation, you know, how meetings are done, how people speak to each other, or the reporting lines. But the best way to look at it in a very, very simple way, the culture is in effect the personality of the organisation. Each of us has our own personalities. Some people are quiet, some people are outgoing, some are introverts. But organisations have the same. They have their own sort of like culture of personality. And it's, as I mentioned there, you know, some where it makes people helpful, dynamic, or plus many others. Okay, so we've now covered why culture is important to organisations, which is effectively, you know, if you want to make a change or do anything in an organisation, you need to understand how the culture works. We've made a quick look at what exactly is culture, which in a very short way is the personality of the firm. But basically, now it's almost like to take a view on how do cultures grow and develop. The culture itself of a firm is shaped and driven by many different factors. And this is a list. So it's management, you know, as they say, basically everything leads from the top. So if you've got a very customer service manager who's very into pleasing clients, you probably find the culture of his team or his firm is very customer focused. If you have a manager who's very aggressive, very tough guy type manager, you find the organisation is that. And that links with behaviours. Behaviours are linked to the way the management. Any experiences, you know, years and years of experience, firms that will shape how firms work. The market and the industry is obviously a factor. Most of my majority of the work, as Simon mentioned, was done in financial services. And if you went back, as probably long before most of you were born, back into the early 90s, the financial services was very alpha male, very aggressive. Everybody wanted to be Gordon Gekko from Wall Street. And it was very aggressive. Structures. Organisations can be very bureaucratic, and not saying bureaucracy is wrong, is a bad idea. Depending on what you're doing, you need controls and bureaucracy in place. But if you know, it can make organisations appear to be slow. And also the history. Organisations have lots of history. Some firms are small. and they probably don't have much history. But again, some of the firms I've worked for have been going since several centuries now. And they've got a long history of doing things in a certain way. And also that links to myths and legends. Some people have worked in organisations where you've had a mythical leader who's led from the front and made everything wonderful. And firms like Virgin and Microsoft and Google and Facebook have that. They have these myths and legends that they have these startup people who do a fantastic job. And all these behaviours all link together to become culture. But it's also to remember that, as I mentioned earlier, organisations will have different subcultures. And it's very important that this is not forgotten, because it will be around things like time zones, locations, different offices. So I remember, and actually one of the case studies actually is along these lines, where you had a overall, like the parent firm was very bureaucratic, very, very thorough in the way they did things. But the actual organisation, the subsidiaries of the organisation were the opposite, and who were very aggressive and far more willing to take massive risks. And therefore you had a large amount of not matching between the cultures. And this is particularly true if organisations contain mergers and acquisitions. Again, I've worked with a number of firms which are a very, very large firm, but it was actually about 5 acquisitions over the years. And there were like 5 separate cultures in the firm. All they did was argue and disagree and complain about each other. But again, this is what helps basically the cultures grow. So moving down to 4. So we've gone through on 1, why is culture so important? You must understand it to get things done. What exactly is culture? It's effectively the personality of the organisation. Bear in mind you can have many separate personalities. How do cultures grow and develop? They just grow over the years with the way behaviours have done it. And then the 4th one, which is like a logical one, is basically how does a culture shape or an organisation? Ultimately, it drives performance. As I mentioned before, the personality organisation drives performance. In the same way, an individual's personality drives their performance. Somebody who's very driven, somebody who's very driven will probably do quite well at work, but also means they could be very aggressive and willing to take risks. Somebody who's very passive is the complete opposite. So if you think about the metaphor of a culture, that will do that. And as I mentioned before, it covers all the areas of the performance of a firm. There's also this phrase that always goes around, and I don't know, I think Warren Buffett said it, so I'm not going to disagree, because he's a trillion times literally more successful than I am. And he says culture eats strategy. But I would actually think about the other way around. I would actually say strategy must match the culture, or the culture must match the strategy. What I'm trying to say here is I've worked at firms who are very, very, who want their strategies to be dynamic, their strategy is to be, innovative on the front load of everything. But the culture is very conservative. The culture is very nervous. For years, maybe in the past, the history of the firms had problems making them major mistakes. So therefore, the strategy doesn't match the culture. In the end result, it won't work. The current, not so much now, but going back many years, organisations were looking to change their culture to make them a better fit. It was very much along the lines of all firms would, quote, want a better culture, whatever that means, I have no idea. And then firms were looking to be much more customer focused, much better employers to play it. So there's a large amount of work on that. But as I remember earlier, and there's some slides on this further on, so I don't want to sort of jump ahead. It's not an easy task to change culture. There's a long amount of effort, and it's really, really hard work and a lot of determination. It's a very gradual, slow and challenging process, and it takes a while to get it done. And remember, if you use the metaphor of a personality's personality, if you want to change somebody's personality, say somebody from being a horrible two-faced snitch to an open, honest person, or even vice versa, it's hard work because people are outside their comfort zone and they don't like it. But it can be done, and I'll come back to that later. Okay, moving on to 5, which is, and 5 and 6 are probably the bulk of the presentation. So we've covered why culture is so important. We'll cover what get it done, what exactly is culture, i.e. a personality, how it grows and develops under 3, i.e. history, behaviours, things that happened in the past, myths and legends. 4, how does a culture shape an organisation? effectively it drives performance, in the same way an individual's personality. So moving on to what factors help or measure a culture, which is actually where it comes to the crux of the presentation, because part of your project work, your assignment work that you're doing as a consultant, you need to understand the culture or define or measure the culture to be able to, to use it. The first thing is when people define a culture, they try and place people into pigeonholes. Place people. Well, people, same thing, but people place cultures into pigeonholes. They say an organisation is aggressive, it's self-learning, customer focused, it's risk averse or risk inaverse. They're passive, or they're machines, the bureaucracies. And again, there's a lot of stuff going on to that. And to be honest with you, from my personal experience, and people tend to think of these as good and bad cultures. But I think the key point to remember is this is somewhat general. How can a whole firm be aggressive? They may have a certain amount of aggression. They may have a certain amount of bureaucracy. They may have a certain amount of self-learning. So I think trying to do these pigeonhole type things is not the best way of doing it. So therefore, what I try to think is a culture is a range of different variables. Although if you can imagine these things on a different type on a slide, what I don't know if there's any statisticians on the line, is what statisticians call a multivariate measure, which is effectively something is measured by more than one variable. And what I've done here is I've actually tried to develop a simple model, which actually got very complicated very, very quickly, on how effectively I can measure it, and obviously you're more than welcome to use it in your work to measure culture. And the first variable, is the difference between internal and external factors. And there's another variable which is hard and tangible factors and soft intangible factors. So when I say internal, I mean factors that are internal to the organisation itself, processes, people, behaviours. When I say external, these are factors outside the organisations. That could be anything from suppliers, customers, regulators, political situations, or even anything, even outside the front door. Hard and tangible factors are factors that are easy to be seen. So they could be profit in the firm, losses in the firm. Soft intangible factors are things that are very much hard to see. So that could be behaviours, way people react and speak to each other. So if you can imagine looking at those, and what you can actually do is in each of these four quadrants, you can put a number of variables or observations that you can use to measure culture. So in the bottom left-hand corner, which is internal and soft factors, there's a number of areas around trust, power basis, teamwork, management, autonomy or lack of it, decision-making, communications. And these are what people traditionally think about doing culture. There are also a number of internal factors sort of moving to the top left now, which are hard or tangible factors. Things like strategic direction, is the organisation siloed, how complex the operating model, which is effectively what happens on a day-to-day basis, any process and controls. And just sort of going around the clock really, there are a number of external factors that can influence culture, how they deal with suppliers, how they deal with the compliance, what's the regulatory environment like, what's the industry like, and what's the competition like. And also the same sort of factors can be soft. So for example, you could have a firm that has a very strong legal approach with customers, but they actually treat them quite nice on a day-to-day basis, or vice versa. So what you'll actually see, most of the areas are actually in the bottom left-hand corner there. So really a lot of the cultural stuff is stuff that's internal to the organisation, but very soft and intangible factors, which makes them very hard to follow and understand. Right, I'm just going to pause there for a sec. I don't know if Antonia, there's any questions on the thing, because for some reason I can't see the chat box.
Yeah, no questions yet.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Okay, so what we'll do here is as I mentioned down here at the bottom left, this is where most of the factors are. So what I'll probably do is for the bulk of this, there's a number of variables listed here, and I'll just go around and talk about these individually and provide some how to measure them, and based from years of normally bad experience on how I suggest you can try and sort of like measure the culture, so you can understand the culture and use it to yourself. So the first one here, which is in sort of a yellow color, is the internal stuff. So first one is trust and integrity. Again, this is quite an important one. Some organisations I've worked with, there's no trust in the firm. They don't. They may actually say they like each other, but you just walk in there and you can feel the tension. And I've got down there, do people trust each other, or is there a culture of watch six? And I think I've got watch six from one of these Star Wars movies, I think. And the idea is it's something to do with fighter pilots, where you look directly over your back. Are you just looking after yourself at the expense of other people? Also, if there's a very indicator of lack of trust, i.e. people just don't trust each other, you'll get a lot of internal politics, you get a lot of game playing, and a general lack of togetherness. Everybody seems to be doing everything on their own. So if you're doing a project there, the most important thing is understand who needs to be involved and ensure they're involved. From a consultant point of view, don't play these trust and integrity game playing games. You're not there. You want to do your job, get the job out, get the bill paid and get going. So be open and honest. And it's not easy to be honest and open on a one-to-one basis. So it's important to build individuals. Listen to what people are saying and try to understand what they're saying. Admit your own mistakes. It's amazing when you work into a piece of work where there's no trust and there's lack of integrity. You put your hand up and say, I've made a mistake. It catches them all off guard and they think, oh, this person's okay. And also be helpful and supportive. One-to-ones are quite good. And also do what you say you're going to do. So if you're going to send an email out by 11 o'clock in the morning, make sure it's gone out by 10:59. If you're going to deliver a report by, a Friday afternoon, make sure it's delivered. So therefore, if you do what you do, and people follow it, you'll actually start to manage to build the trust. The second one relates to power bases. And this is quite an interesting one, actually, because all organizations have power bases. And they can either be what I call direct power bases, and that's from positional power. Managers have more power than their staff, and senior managers have more power than managers, ultimately all the way up to whoever runs the organisation and shareholders. So therefore, that's one thing. But one of the other things, especially in some organisations, is to understand the indirect power basis. And that often comes from technical knowledge. For example, you might have Fred in the IT team, who's the one who understands all the technology, and you do everything with him. Or you may have from politics, you may have an internal committee that for some reason gets themselves involved in everything. So the key thing on this one is to understand the direct power bases, such as leadership and management, and understand how that works. If you need to get them to make decisions, understand the decision-making process. Is it done around the coffee machine, or do you have formal reports or various committees? And for the indirect power bases, again, good to try and understand what they are. It's worthwhile asking people who are there, who are the people to speak to. And the only real way to manage them is to build good relationships with them and be their friends. You need them on side. You need them to be helpful for what you're doing. So again, it's because it's a indirect power base. Be friends with them. Buy them a coffee, take them out for a pint after work. Get to know how they work, what makes them do, and if they like you, you'll have influence on that power base. The next one relates to teamwork, and this is very much along the lines of how well, and I put really in single quotes, work together. Again, every organisation I work with said they've got great teamwork. Everybody's committed to the cause or whatever they're doing, the strategic objectives. But I'm sure everybody's on this call can say they've worked at places where there's no teamwork. They say their team works, but they don't seem to work together. And for whatever reason, maybe it's lack of trust, lack of integrity, power bases, or in fact they just don't like each other. Therefore, again, a lack of teams or lack of teamwork is a good indicator of politics, poor trust and self-protection. If you notice that's happening, some of the actions is find out who needs to be involved in your projects. Again, you may have to go around on a one-to-one basis speaking to people. It's bit of an uncomfortable conversation, but has to be done, and involve them together. Include them consistently in your assignments. So, if you've got somebody from technology or a user base or a legal person or a marketing person needs to be involved, make sure they're involved all the time. Don't dip in and dip out, because that will just create inconsistency and a lack of trust. Remember, trust people to do their job, even if you don't trust them. So it's a case of trying to work out. Make sure they do the job without actually doing the job for them. So, for example, I've worked in places where I've had people working for me doing a not so good job. I'll have regular chats with them once a day. I'll have a one-to-one with them first thing in the morning to check how they're getting on and make sure they're okay. But also, as part of that, I'm ensuring they're doing their tasks. Be very clear regarding communications. Don't innuendos, don't try and speak in waffle. Lots of clear bullet points, so it's crystal clear, so the teams know what they need to do and how they need to work together. Say thank you. It's amazing how the word thank you, whether it's done via email or over or verbally in a meeting or over Teams, it's amazing how much people love you if they think you're appreciated. And also, if they've generally done a good job, why not say thank you? You need to. It helps with building trust and integrity, and also generates teamwork. And if you're on side and you need to do some work and people aren't forming teams, take the lead to building team. Arrange the meeting, do the prep meeting, arrange the calls, do the minutes. Because you're there to do an assignment, and if you don't do the assignment, you're going to fail. You'll get a bad reputation, and even if it's not your fault. So remember, then you need to work with them on that. The next one relates to management. So how supportive are management to the staff, and more importantly to consultants? Again, I've never worked in a place where the management said they're not supportive to their staff. They've always said they're supportive. We love our staff and our staff love us. And I'm sure everybody's been on calls and discussions where it's complete opposite. And also need to understand from the management how knowledgeable the management are. There's probably two areas of management particularly doing. There's going to be some technical management or technical knowledge in lieu of what needs to be done. So if you're working, say, for an oil firm, you assume the person understands the oil industry, the manager, or if you're working for, as I work in, at the moment, I work in financial services, you assume they understand the area of financial services. The other area also is to understand the soft skills. One of the big challenges around management is managing the people. And bear in mind, consultancy is often very much an individual person industry. So therefore, if these management you feel don't have technical skills or soft skills, you need to identify this earlier so it can be managed. So the first thing around the actions is initially work out a working relationship with your senior management. You might want to have regular calls with them. I mean, depending on the projects I've done, I've had one-to-ones on a regular basis with the management who's employing me. Just to build trust, work with them, give you an update and lead them through the project. You might want to send end of week emails out, etc., to make things good. Also, one of the other good things, it comes back to the point above about saying thank you. It's good to ask the management to visibly support the team, because it gives the team some encouragement and it makes them feel good if the management is visibly support them. And also, the next two that I've sort of covered already, if there are any technical skills that you feel there are gaps, and then I've worked in a thing where I worked with a manager. It was a very technical sort of technology project actually, and the manager, while he was a really, really nice guy, very good soft skills, he didn't really understand technology at all. So therefore, to get decisions done, I had to tactfully ask somebody else to be involved, and I explained it along the lines of to saying, you might need some help for some of these decisions. But, if you've got a manager who doesn't have the technical skills you're working for, you're on to a loser. So you need to plug those skills. And likewise, if you've got a manager who's got poor skills, I've got think skilled there. You need to be thick skinned. Because sometimes a manager who's got poor skills, somebody can be quite rude, even though they're not mean to be rude, or they can be quite dismissive again without doing it. Sometimes, if you're built into a consultancy where you might have to take this on the chin. But the key thing is, I mentioned earlier, the top point is to try and work out your working relationship with senior management, and it will require a lot of proactive work from the consultant. Autonomy and decision making. Basically, how much decision making can staff make? Can people make decisions freely within obviously their job domains, or are they or they're nervous of making decisions, or they need to refer it to their management or go upstairs, as the case may be, or they just delay it, or they want another committee. A lack of freedom to make decisions can cause congestion, especially if you've got major decisions on your assignment to make, and an ultimate thing, it basically just clogs everything up. And there's also often a sign of lack of trust in the staff. So again, actions again from painful many years of experience, bad experience again. Understand what decisions need to be made as part of your project. Do you need, if you're doing a software development, who can sign off the specs, who can sign off the test scripts, who can sign off the software, and who can actually make those decisions. Is it a technical specialist? Is it a forum? Do you have to go up, ultimately, depending on what you do, you might have to go up to CEO or even a board director. As part of that, you need to understand what the process for making these decisions are. Some smaller firms, you just shout across the office and everybody has a vote. But other organisations I've worked with, you have to even go to the regulator to make some decisions. So again, you need to work out the decision path. If you find that this is restrictive, for whatever reason, decisions aren't getting made, so even though it's a very painful discussion and you're going to feel uncomfortable, but you do need to outline the issues to management, because if decisions aren't being made and there's no autonomy, you can't do your job. And the key thing is to speak to management about then, see if any autonomy or even more autonomy of decision making can be made. Human management. This is a great phrase. It doesn't really match to anything. It's basically how do people work with each other? How do they interact with each other? Yeah, if people work very well with each other and they're friendly, pat yourself on the back and thank God that you've actually got a good project. But you can even, when people don't work well together, there's two scenarios. One is that they are open and nasty and toxic to each other. Sometimes you can walk into these offices and you can feel the tension. Or the other thing is that they're actually friendly to each other, but behind the back, they're all backsniping. So again, you just need to understand the interactions through individual points. So again, as I mentioned, under the actions, this is another issue that's hard to manage. But again, as a consultant, you've got to be professional and whiter than white. Don't play silly games. You're there to do a job. Remember, if you speak to people, be very polite, very concise, very factual. Don't get involved in the emotions and the backbiting or the silly party politics they're playing. Again, one of these days, they're going to learn how to spell thick. You need to be thick-skinned. And also think ahead. If you're going to have problems with individuals, for example, a project I worked on about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a number of people in there, and how they didn't end up having a punch up in the office was actually completely beyond me. So what I used to do is speak to them all individually before key review meetings to get them all agreed. Going into the meeting was a bit more straightforward. And anything that you've agreed or anything you've not agreed, make sure it's clearly documented, normally via email. So there's no ambiguity. People can't disagree, and keep the documentation very, very, very factual. Almost covered this section. Communication. A lot of organisations freely admit they struggle with communications. If you've got an organisation across many time zones, many locations, many offices, many disciplines, it's hard to do it. And also when people get communications from head office type thing, they just treat it with a little bit of discord and just spam it, ignore it, or just ridicule it, but very rarely read it. So therefore, it's very important to understand how communication in the firm works. If it's very clear, you're good. That's very good. So it's not a problem. But if people are very vague about communication, if they're not very keen to report bad news, or especially they're trying to spin it to sound good, or it's not reported at all, you have a problem, because you will need to report bad news in assignments. Whether you've made a mistake or the client's made a mistake or something nasty's happened. And also, how frequent is communication? Is it regular communication or as and when required? Again, this understands, because if an organisation doesn't communicate well or ignores bad news, these things will explode like a volcano later on. So, as I said before, if communication is not free flowing, you may have an issue. So therefore, what you probably need to do with your relevant stakeholders you're working with, management, developers, testers, lawyers, whoever, you need to work out how to manage the communication with these stakeholders. Typically, I try and do face-to-face communications or over Teams and Zoom, as it is these days, depending where you are. But emails and updates are always quite good as well. Again, you need to ensure it meets the audience. Don't make it too wordy. Communicating bad news is, again, no one likes doing it, but as a consultant, you will end up doing it. It's just fortunately a fact of life. So a key thing is always speak to your stakeholders how they would like to receive bad news. The clients I've worked with on the whole say, I want to hear it straight away via email, put the word urgent, bad news, email in the email title, something like that. But some people might want an email, a telephone call, or a Teams message. Again, work that up front so it's all crystal clear. And also, as any communication, try to keep everything to the pure facts and remove things like verbs and opinions. For example, you may say, for example, you're doing a piece of testing, you found a number of showstoppers. I would say something like, with testing is in progress, we found 3 showstoppers, which is puts the live data at risk. I suppose the same, testing is in progress, we found an incredibly large number of annoying showstoppers, which is actually making the go live date very, very hard. Again, both the same message, but very, very different ways of saying it. And the other item there is risk appetite, is basically how risky or not as a firm may be. If a firm has low risk appetite, which most firms do, to be fair, it can make something very slow and hard to work with, because they want to consider every option, review it from every lens, and probably get 1,001 views on it. But if it's high risk, again, and people like to think that high risk is a good idea, it can also mean they're freewheeling and they just proceed. And often high risk firms are not naturally high risk. They just don't understand the risk. They sort of ignore them. So again, if somebody says they're risky and they're quite blasé about this thing, that's not always a good thing. So again, you need to understand that. As I mentioned there, high level risk is a good indicator on the speed of organisation. Low risk causes nervousness, and high risk can result in perceived reckless behaviour. Fear and resistance. Again, let's say, I was trying to think the best way of saying, how fearful of people for raising issues. I've worked in projects before where the clients I'm working with, the staff I was working with, were so scared of their management, they wouldn't raise any risks, because any issues or any problems, because they knew they were going to get a volley of abuse from their management. So ultimately, I was a poor bloke that had to go and explain all these problems to the client, which was particularly pleasant, I must admit. But the problem was, though, is the management had lack of support. Go back to the other one. There was lack of trust, a previous slide on that, and people just didn't want to raise issues. So if they can't raise issues, it's an issue, as I mentioned there, you need to understand what the cause of this fear is. And the only real way to do this is, if you feel there's fear of this, is to work with the individuals on a one-to-one basis to understand why they're scared. Are they scared that they're going to get let's say, some adverse feedback, or are they scared that it's going to lose their job? And again, if you need to do any bad news going up the chain, it's best to involve other people in there, the more competent in raising issues, because if 3 or 4 people go to a rather aggressive manager with an issue, the manager will listen. Individuals go to them, the manager might just back them down. And the other area, which is a very important area at the moment, is diversity and inclusion, or inclusion and diversity, as I put it. So apologies for the wrong way around. Again, no firm I've ever met go out and say they're not inclusive or they're not diverse. And it covers obviously areas around sort of gender, race, sex, etc., which is obviously a very, very important subject. But also, a lot of organisations are also looking around diversity around different backgrounds. For example, having people from different parts of, just using the UK example, different parts of the UK, people who've got different educations. Maybe people have been people who've been privately educated, all the way down to people who left school at 16 without any ideas. And again, firms who are generally good at inclusion and diversity do work better, because you get, the more different diverse teams you have, the more different views on the world you have. As I mentioned before, many firms say they're D&I, but they're not. This does create a problem, as I mentioned earlier. Therefore, if you feel the teams you're working for are not diverse and as close as they can, for example, haven't got enough junior staff involved, or you haven't got enough senior staff involved, then seek out these people and try and involve them as much as you can. Because ultimately, you remember you're there to deliver an assignment. So everything you can do to get the assignment done, it will be better. Okay, so that was quite a lot to cover, actually. So apologies for that. And if you're still with me, I do thank you. So we've covered the bottom left-hand corner there, and it relates to obviously all the internal and soft tangible factors. The next one now is to look at the internal hard factors of stuff that's still internal to the organisation, but is actually easier to see. And there's a number of those. The first one relates to strategic direction. Every firm has every firm who wants to survive has a strategy. But the problem is a lot of these strategies aren't really understood, even though they're communicated. They're often some sort of like strategic waffle that no one really understands, and they often become a figure of fun. In fact, one of the case studies talks about this point in a bit more detail. But ultimately, the thing is, if people do not believe in the organisation strategy, then basically it creates issues with their own roles. They don't focus on the bigger picture, which creates internal politics because they're very much looking after themselves as opposed to the firm. So therefore, if you feel that your teams do not understand the strategy or your client doesn't understand the strategy that they're following, it may be worthwhile doing some sort of education on the strategy so they can understand where your project fits in with the bigger picture. Organisations are siloed. Again, siloed isn't a bad thing. If you have organisations focused on different parts around the world, may have somebody who does, like the call centre, some people does the administration. There's nothing wrong with silos, but it can actually create the barriers in between, especially if you're trying to change everything. But basically, if the silos do cause issues with processes and politics, then you have a problem. And one of the biggest reasons for siloed problems is often poorly completed acquisitions. 2 or 3 firms have been merged legally anyway, but they haven't actually merged, say, for example, the sales team, or they haven't merged the marketing team or the ops team. So effectively, behind the scenes, culturally, use that phrase, they're 3 separate firms, but ultimately, legally, they're one firm. And that's a nightmare because you try and change everything 3 times. But the key thing is, you're on as a project manager or an assignment or a consultant coming in, unless your piece of work is to clear or fix a siloed issue, you need to work. I've got then need to work around it. It's probably best you need to work with it. So therefore, all you can do is really ensure everybody from different parts of the silos are agreed. It could in a project assignment, whether you've got working groups or communication plans. It could involve a large number of people involved, but ultimately, if the nature or the structure of the firm requires this, then you've got no choice. Operating model. Now this is a fantastic consultant's phrase, so I love using, especially you use target operating model. You can use the acronym TOM. But ultimately, this is the operating model is all the processes, peoples, and systems that runs the firm on a regular basis. So anything from dealing with the clients, collecting invoices, providing websites, etc. And the key thing is the operating model itself is very rarely well documented, very rarely documented very well. Which basically means it's not really understood. If you walk into a firm and you say, "Show me your operating model," they're going to look at you like, "Well, we've got this bit documented and we've got that bit documented, but the rest of it's all over the place." Which basically means often it's very complicated, and this complexity can actually be highlighted by different technologies, different systems, a multitude of suppliers, especially if multitude of locations and time zones. So if you can imagine this sort of like patchwork quilt of different things sticks together, the organisation runs. If you are looking to change the operating model, for example, you're upgrading a new piece of technology, or you're looking to develop a new business line, you need to really understand what the operating model does. Because otherwise, if you don't update the operating model, your project won't work or your assignment won't work. So therefore, there's a number of ways you can do it. Obviously, one of the things you can actually do is sit there, go into the assignment and document the operating model, but I don't imagine the client's going to allow you to do that because I'd rather spend client probably get quite offended in that. So really what you need to do is seek out experts for the different parts of the operating model and get them involved. And again, this comes down to like power bases earlier. These are going to be indirect power bases with people who are very, like the technical experts. So again, it's a case of getting them involved. And the other thing you often find, you've got single points of knowledge. So, and technology is actually a quite key challenge of this. You have somebody who's the technological boffin who will understand all of that. And again, may not be able to get them involved because of all because they can't do everything. But ultimately, if you don't understand the operating model and you don't have the people involved who understand the operating model, you're there for a failing. Processes and controls, which I guess is part of the operating model, but I pulled it out here because I like a long list. Basically, the processes and controls with an organisation. Ultimately, if you want a process, it should be able to control the way the firm works. Stops banks going overdrawn. You should ensure that websites don't crash. Ensures that invoices or consultants get paid on time. But bear in mind, one of the problems you can have some of these processes, it can be very, very constraining. I've worked at places where you have to fill forms in to get anything done really. It was just really, really pointless. And basically what you can be done is anything you've got very, very constraining or top heavy processes basically means it often can be used as a political tool. It can be used as a way to stop things happening and allow people to keep indirect power bases. Right, I can just see one chat message appearing. What I would probably do is I'll just finish this line and I'll come back to that in a sec. Again, with the process controls, actions, you really need to work within the rules. Again, unless you're being brought in to change the rules, you're not going to change them. You just need to understand and work with them. Pain in the backside, but a lot easier to do. So basically, if you've got
No, go ahead, Paul. Just the comment is from me. Just a reminder to everybody.
All right, sorry. Okay, yeah. That's fine. No, thanks, Antonio. So basically, if the processes are quite heavy, they can be bureaucratic and political and self-preservation or self-preserving. Basically, you need to find out how these work and ensure you fit in with them. If there's forms or forums that need to be included in decisions, make sure you understand and get yourself involved. It's an absolute pain, but basically it's a lot easier. But on the other hand, if you've got no processes or little processes, you can actually be quite scary because you really have no idea how things get done. So therefore, sometimes I've worked in places before where I was doing a technology upgrade. There was no processes around testing or a DR or BCP, as it was called in those days. And I therefore actually sat down and came up with some high-level processes around change controls and testing approaches and live migrations. Basically because there's nothing there. But again, you need to understand what's there so you can work with it. And money, we all like money. Well, I do anyway. So basically, how much does the firm be willing to spend any money? Are they free spending? Organisations that free spending tend to be very cash rich. Oil companies, some financial services firms, some technology firms are very, very cash rich. But basically means sometimes if they are freewheeling, they may be very, very poor controls because they're just happy to throw money at stuff. Because they've got so much cash. Or alternative, if the firms are unwilling or unable because they're not cash rich to spend money, that can obviously create constraints. Obviously, you need to work out how much money you've got for your assignments. Depends on the project. Sometimes you're brought in and you don't have any budget controls. You might be alternative. You're brought in to do a budget control. Therefore, you need to understand how the financial management processes work. So if you need to spend money on a new supplier or you need to spend money on a piece of hardware, you need to understand that work. There's always a purchase order and seems to go through approvals. But also the other thing is build good relationships with the finance staff because you may need their help. You may have an invoice that needs to pay quickly. It's a lot easier if you know how somebody on there to rig up and explain, can you get this pushed to the front of the queue? It's a lot easier. And also firms who have little money or tight budgets can be nervous when asked to spend more money. Again, if you build good relationships with a finance firm and, as I mentioned before, building good relationships with your management, it's a lot easier to request more money. Not you always get it, but you feel much more comfortable about requesting more money if you feel you've got the support of others. Right, okay. I'm just going to have a sip of water because I'm losing my voice. Thank you. So what we've done there, we've done the items section on the left, which is all the internal stuff, both hard and tangible. and soft, intangible. And again, hopefully you found that useful, and some of the variables and some of the hints and tips. Again, it's not an exhaustive list. I've only been doing this 30 years. I'm sure if you speak to some other people, and including yourself, there's probably 1,001 other things that can be done. But now we're going to look at on the right hand side, and I'm going to do all the external stuff together because they are very, very linked together. And I just don't really want to sort of waste, it gets a bit duplicated, and I appreciate that. So the first one relates to suppliers. All organisations without fail use suppliers. And the key thing is how well they manage suppliers. There are issues with suppliers actually have more power than the customer. And I've worked with a supplier, basically tells a customer what they can do, which is obviously not ideal. But sometimes these big outsourcing agreements, big technology outsourcing agreements, the outsourcing firm actually has more, can actually dictate what happens to the customer because of the way the contract's been defined. Also, the other thing with suppliers, if you, one of the issues that I've noticed that culturally is a cultural mismatch between the supplier and the customer. I worked with a customer once who was about 10 people actually, and they could, and it was very free, it was very freewheeling, it was very quick. They made decisions almost instantly. They dealt with a supplier who was a major American bank, one of the biggest firms in the world actually, one of the biggest, probably one of the biggest firms in the world, who were very, slow, not slow, but very bureaucratic. They had very, very formal processes, and there was such a mismatch there. It was actually quite frustrating, and moving on to the hilarious side. And also the other thing is, one of the big cultural issues around suppliers is how many suppliers a firm has. Firms may have different outsourcing arrangements, may have different technology providers, may have different manufacturing providers, maybe distributors or manufacturing fleets. The more more suppliers a firm has, the more interaction and problems you have. So if you've got lots of individual suppliers, you may have some problems because you need to work them together. So the key thing there is understand who owns the supplier relationships and how the interaction works. What are the procedures for getting changes done? How do you track stuff? What's the change controls? And then also, again, as I said before, you're not going to change any supplier management processes in the short term. But the key thing is just to understand what the process is, understand the compliant and the supplier impact is. And also, when you work with suppliers, build a good relationship with the suppliers. You're going to have to work with these people to deliver your assignment. And if you've got a software vendor you're dealing with, there's no point fighting against them. There's no point having arguments with them because it won't work. Build a relationship with them, even if you don't like them. And that may be a case of, going out for a regular coffee or just being pleasant when you speak to them. Again, if you've got suppliers on these firms, you need to work with them very, very closely. In a sort of like same but complete opposite way, relates to customers. Again, what is the makeup or the construct of the clients that a firm has? Does it have a large number of big clients, like big institutional clients? Because obviously, while they can obviously generate lots of revenue, they can be incredibly demanding, and they want the bang for their buck. Are they small clients, like small firms, retail clients, like individuals or institutions? Again, there's no right or wrong thing, but you just need to understand the dynamics of the clients, because what you tend to find with, if an organization has a lot of like retail individual clients, everything seems to be very standard. They don't want to do any bespoke processes for individual clients because they don't pay the money, to be honest with you. But if you've got a large number of individual, big institutional corporate clients, there tend to be obviously less of them, but very, very bespoke. And the other thing is how well customers managed. Are they managed well? Are they just treated with contempt? Again, I've never met an organization that says they don't love their customers. But when you get into an organization, quite a lot of a lot of them do actually hate their customers, and they just see them as an annoying thing to get in the way. And the other thing, who has most control? Again, it's very similar to the supplier item above, but in reverse. Is the firm got control over the customers and can tell the customers what to do, or the customer dictates to them, or somewhere in between? And again, the cultural fit between big customer and big suppliers and what have you is the same sort of thing. And the other thing is, so therefore, some of the actions, again, it's a bit samey to the supplier stuff, but but different side of the coin, is to understand the client base and whether the firm is nervous about any clients. If you're doing a major outsourcing piece of work or doing anything, find out, what clients are going to be impacted, because, firms who've got a culture of being very customer reactive or customer friendly will be very nervous about upsetting their clients. And again, internally, you're going to have to manage these customers through a process. Make sure that you build relations with the client and relationship team to involve them. Again, if they're very customer focused, they would appreciate, you going through them, and only ever approach customers with permission of the internal teams. Never go direct. The next one relates to the excuse me, losing my voice. The regulatory environment. Every firm every organisation or industry has some sort of regulation. Aerospace, financial services is incredibly heavily regulated. I think I did a presentation on financial services a couple of months ago, and I said the biggest growth area in financial services is regulation. And it is. So if you've got a very powerful organisation that's got a powerful regulation behind it, as well as a powerful regulator, it can actually make the whole the organisation quite nervous. Actually, it can be quite a drag because they're very worried about upsetting clients and upsetting the regulator, and that also implies for customers and suppliers. Therefore, you need to understand basically how heavy the regulation is, also how well the regulation does, and does this regulation cause any behaviours like nervousness or slowness in decision making, or just no decision making. Therefore, once you've understood the regulatory impact, you need to then understand the owners of the regulation and work with these people to understand how they want to manage the regulator. Right, I can see another question on there. I don't know, Antonio, you can read that out. Unfortunately, the chat box has disappeared.
No, I don't see any question yet.
Yeah. Oh, it's about somebody leaving actually. So, okay, that's cool. Okay, let's go. Competition. The next one relates to competition. I suppose not all firms. If you work for local government or national government, you don't have competition in the strictest sense. But if you work in the commercial area or even the charitable area, you have competition. So therefore, how competitive is the firm? Again, every firm says they're competitive. Every firm said they're hungry for business. But some firms, especially if they're large firms, they've got a lot of internal politics, don't always seem to be that competitive. And also, what do they do with the competition? Do they lead firms? Do they follow the competition or just copy it? Again, there's nothing wrong with those. Lots of firms, and I won't mention names, but are made or perceived to be innovative and leading edge, but all they do is copy the competition. Again, the competitive nature of a firm is not much you can do about it. Market leaders can be innovative, which is actually quite nice, but they can also be very arrogant and hate being questioned or challenged by consultants. I must admit, I've had a number of, let's say, far from pleasant discussions with clients on that, which I've completely misjudged the culture of the organisation. But also, firms who are not leaders can be innovative, but also they can be demotivated and resigned to failure. For example, if they're always the worst firm or they're on the customer service list, they just become that. And again, you're not going to change that. You just need to understand that so you can sort of work with them in the sort of like the culture of it. And market industry, again, this fits samely from the previous ones. And the key thing around there, what is the dynamics of the marketplace? Financial services I've worked in previously. At the moment, it's, I would say, reasonably stable at the moment. Maybe 15 years ago, it was fast changing and unregulated, which is probably why we had the credit crunch. Well, it is why we had the credit crunch. But, some industries like technology on the whole tends to be very fast changing. Other industries, say, for example, I work in charity as well, tends to be really stable and slow. Again, not much you can do about that. It's the nature of the beast. But as you mentioned, fast-moving industries tend to make decisions quicker and possibly recklessly, which means as a consultant, you probably want to have a bit of prudence around that to make sure they're not dashing off the edge of a cliff. And likewise, slower-moving industries often making decisions slower, and it can be painful because they're just they can't make any decisions at all. So therefore, as a consultant, you may need to do the other way around. You may be able to sort of like try and GM forward. Okay, so what we've done now, as I said before, section 5 is probably the bulk of the presentation, and we've gone through what had to help or define a measure of culture. So I hope that, and the point I was making earlier on is that a culture is a series of variables that need to measure, and there's no right way of done. But the checklist here, well, the breakdown of the checklist I tend to use when I'm working on assignments, initially to try and get an idea of, what I need to do, what behaviours I need to do, what behaviours I need to dodge, and basically to make sure that I can sort of like plug myself into the personality or culture of the organisation to make things happen. Okay, so obviously section 5 was quite a deep section. So I think one of the next section is obviously we've gone through what culture is so important, why, so what is it, how do they develop, how does it shape an organisation, and a large number of variables on how to measure it. I want to talk about how ways you can change an organisation's culture, because while I've stressed the point sometimes it's easier and is more prudent and pragmatic to try and fit in with the organisation's strategy, the organisation's culture, you may actually join a project, and I've done it myself, where you've been brought in to change the organisation's culture, and it's can be done, but it's not easy. So therefore, that's slightly ahead of myself. It can be done, but it's not easy. But what I've done here, I think there's 13 or 12 of these, I must admit, I can't count, on basically a sequence of steps of questions or things to be done that you need to do. So the first item there, I hope you can see the orange, is be clear about what culture you want. People just go, we're going to change our culture to make it better. But it doesn't actually mean anything to anyone. So you might want to say, first thing is, you want to be more customer friendly, you want to be more dynamic, you want to be more cost effective, anything like that. You want to be more aggressive. So you need to understand what the culture is you want to be done and how you can measure it. And you can measure it in different ways. You can do staff surveys, you can do surveys with the customers, you can do supplier surveys, you can just do general public surveys. Therefore, you need to work out how you're going to measure success. And it's like any change project. You need to work out what you're doing the change for and how you're going to measure success. And as part of that, set yourself some plan with interim milestones. For example, I worked with a client who wanted to try and improve their customer satisfactions. So they employed 4 or 5 different firms to review their customers' satisfaction. So they got different views on it. And they would come up with different milestones around trying to be more pleasant to customers, opening the branches, as a bank actually, more hours, and they had all these different changes, and then they would review the feedback from customers through the same surveys on a regular basis to see if anything was making a difference. And for them, it did. Once you define what the culture is and how it's going to be measured, you need to define the behaviours that are needed and what is not negotiable. As I said earlier before, culture is driven by behaviours, and basically what people do. So therefore, you have to make it crystal clear what behaviours are acceptable and non-acceptable. So going back to this customer survey, this customer improvement cultural project I did earlier, a couple of years ago. It was basically a lot of the behaviours were along the lines around what was acceptable was, answering the phone and what have you. What was not acceptable was actually most of the work. It was things like not having client emails answered for longer than 24 hours, not answering the phone, not responding to written communication within 48 hours. So there was a long list of not acceptable behaviours. And by making that very clear, people really knew where they stood or didn't stand. The key thing, again, is to make sure the culture matches with the strategy. You don't really want a culture that is very different from the strategy. So if you, as I mentioned earlier, I use that phrase, I think Warren Buffett, who's done quite well for himself, said culture eats strategy, culture eats strategy, or something like that. But again, if you've got a strategy that's very different from the culture, you will never succeed. I think the people also need to be accountable for the changes. So bearing in mind, if behaviours for organisations have been changing. For example, you want to make the organisation much more open to change, or make management much more accessible. You need senior management to be accountable for this. So the actions need to be visible, and there needs to be support for people. You can't just have somebody at the top shouting down, we're going to change the culture. You need to have workshops, you need to have coaches, you need to have the support processes. And I've got down there, you need champions. You need somebody who's going to be the customer support champion, or the passing up bad news about fear of getting sacked champion. And people who do the good behaviour, they should be rewarded, in their appraisals, getting a tick in the left-hand box as opposed to the right-hand box, as well as pay rises and other things like that. But you have to also get to the situation where not everybody's going to change into the new culture. it's just life. Unfortunately, some people don't want to change, and some people just can't see the reason for change. So therefore, we will need to maybe remove or even punish people for constant bad behaviours, and ultimately that could result in sacking people, or alternatively, and replace them with new staff who fit the cultural fit. And I worked for a fund manager many months ago who were very into their cultural fit, and would everybody be the same. Even for a consultant, I had 6 interviews, which I don't think I've had 6 interviews in when I was at Permanent many years ago, because they wanted to ensure that I fit in with the culture, and they got loads of people just to interview me to make sure that was okay. Make sure processes match the culture, or the other way around, the inner workings of the organisation match what's going on. So if you want an organisation that is free-flowing, decision-making, or that wants to be done, make sure the processes don't stop, are free-flowing and make decisions making. Alternatively, if you've got an organisation that you want to make the controls a bit more stringent because of the risk of the organisation, for example, you're building nuclear missiles, you need lots of controls around them. Make sure the people's, the processes, any communications match that. So ensure processes match the culture. You don't want to say we want to change the culture, but the processes stop that. Make visible changes immediately. Again, this is sort of like textbook change management stuff. Visible changes enforce changes. If people see things that are happening, they will follow it. And again, the lesson needs to be set by senior management. You can't just have it been done at a junior level because nothing ever gets done. Make sure the culture matches the brand. A lot of these organisations like Virgin will have a culture of not being the cheapest, but very, very good customer service. You can argue the same for a BMW, a Mercedes for cars. So their culture is very much around customer servicing and providing a quality product, and also the brand matches that. We have other areas, I won't say who they are, who very much say, for example, we're not going to have the best product, but we're going to have the cheapest product. So again, the brand needs to match that. So if you've got a brand that you're that has a mismatch with the culture, again, you've got a problem. And obviously the best way to do the brand is get agencies involved, communications out to the marketplace, going adverts and a PR plan. Set success measures, and I'm sort of mentioning that on the top one actually. If you can't measure, obviously if you're trying to define the culture, you need to understand whether you've moved or not. So you need to measure what the culture is. Therefore, if you have constant measures for the success, and I mentioned earlier, you could do staff surveys, interviews with staff, speak to your customers, suppliers. Best thing to do is also get externals to do these reviews. There's lots of firms who can do lots of good measurements. As I mentioned earlier, there was a firm who does a lot of stuff earlier, and they got 5 or 6 firms to do it. So you can measure success, and if things aren't on track, then you can make changes. Unfortunately, changing culture costs money. Everything costs money. You may want to do training on cultural changes. You may need to get process changes, which can involve technology changes. Communication needs to be done. If you're going to get external monitoring done, that costs money. So therefore, be prepared to spend. Culture does not change overnight. Many firms, and I've worked at firms, think by just clicking the fingers, doing a bit of training, getting a couple of rah-rah sessions in a local town hall, change would change overnight. Depending on the size of the organisation, it could take years to complete, especially if it's a large organisation spread over many firms, so many locations. So therefore, the key thing is be persistent and determined. And in a similar way, sort of regarding take of time, there will be problems. It's not an easy. Any change project's not easy, and because of the sort of like internal soft, intangible element of the culture. You will get resistance, you'll get fear. People generally misunderstand what you're trying to do. Some people misunderstand on purpose, but some people do misunderstand. So therefore, you need to ensure there's support in place. People feel uncomfortable about being more bureaucratic, or people who are very nervous, or very safe people very nervous about being a little bit more freewheeling. They need to be supported and they need to be looked after. So therefore, it needs, as well as this, it needs clear communication. And last but not least, be brave. As I mentioned earlier, it will take time, it will cost money, will there be problems, it will be hard work. So therefore, nothing has ever been done by easiness. So if you're looking to change the culture, don't expect it to happen as a very, very sequential. Yes, everything's perfect. You'll have lots of backs and forths that you need to do. Okay.
Oh, we have
question.
a quick question, a clarification. We have mentioned about making cultural changes, about that some organization may want to see the visibility on these changes quickly, but this may contradict the fact that the question is from Ayana, so maybe he can express it. But basically, this could contradict. But to have a solid change at cultural level, you have to give time to people to adapt, right? Ayana, am I missing anything?
Yeah. No, you're completely correct. So, what I mean to ask was, there was in the process, if you go back to the previous slide, there was there was a process which said that, make these cultural changes visible ASAP.
Yeah.
So yeah, my question was in that aspect, that if we try to make the cultural changes visible, firstly, how can we make the culture itself visible? I think don't people take their own time to imbibe what's already happening and what actions the company is really taking? So I just wanted to know your further thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I understand what you're saying. I must admit, when I've worked at places of cultural change, there's a certain amount of skepticism over these cultural changes. People just think it's a nice thing. But obviously some organisations are actually very committed to making it. I think the point I was trying to make, maybe I didn't come across very well, is that it does take a long time to change a culture, especially if it's a multinational company or just a very large company. But I think the key thing, what I'm trying to say, is that some people will adapt to cultural changes quicker than others. And I think the point is that if people can see that people are changing cultures or adopting the new culture, make that visible, because if people see other people are doing it and make them more involved, make them feel much more committed to it.
Okay.
But I think the key point is, and I probably didn't, it was on the slide, but I probably didn't mention it very well, is I think the peak understand is that people change at different speeds. I must admit, when I was younger, I was much more adaptable to changing things, but now I'm a bit stuck in my ways. So therefore each individual needs, well, not individual, but each area needs to be treated on its own. And actually the case study, actually, I think one of the two, I can't remember which one is first, but the two case studies actually talks about that point, is where a cultural change was forced on departments and teams who didn't need the culture change at all. So the whole thing became well, not a joke, but it became a figure of fun. So is that okay to answer your question? I mean, please feel free to ask any more.
Okay. No, it does answer my question. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so almost there now. I think I'm just checking my clock. We've got about 15 minutes to go, so hopefully we'll finish in the next 10 minutes. So the next one relates to a number of case studies. So I've got two case studies, case study 1 or 2. So this related to, this comes back to Diana, the point you made earlier, which is actually quite good, actually, because this case study sort of touches on this. There was a large multinational organisation that was a market leader, and it was very, very good, very, very profitable, good firm, had a good reputation. But it felt, compared to some of its smaller, newer competitors, it was very bureaucratic. It was slow in making changes, and they also had the fact that a large workforce spread over many locations. So they were based in London, Dublin, multiple European locations, Australia, and multiple in North America and South America. And each individual location would have its own unique culture. Irish firms, Irish people are different to UK people, who are different from Italian people, who are different from Australians, and so on. But what they wanted to do holistically, almost as a top-down thing, they wanted to change the culture to be more agile, quicker, and reactive, i.e. to try and combat their more nimble or perceived nimble competitors and competition. So they started to roll out something called new ways of working across the organisation. And there's almost like a toolkit of agile processes, Kaizen boards, stand-ups across the board. And it was almost like a brochure, like a toolkit handed out. So the impact was mixed, to put it politely. It did help reduce the process complexity, etc., across some areas. But not all teams needed to change. If you're a small team, some of the European teams weren't bureaucratic. Some of the Australian teams were very rapid in decision making. But organisations were forced to adopt the new ways of working. So, they were told that they had to run agile, even if waterfall was better. They were told that they had to have stand-ups as team meetings, So people were taking chairs out of meeting rooms, which sort of like petty to the point. So therefore, the whole of this new ways of working was deemed compulsory. And if you hadn't had your new ways of working certificate from the central team, you almost seemed like not fit for purpose, like a second-class citizen. So this actually caused a large amount of skepticism, particularly around some of these online tools and Kanban boards, etc. But the other thing that I think was particularly awkward about the implementation is that while the whole thing was being less bureaucratic, making decisions quicker, etc., senior management processes did not change at all. So while, for example, an individual team could come up with a prospect for a new client or a new onboarding or a new product, when it went up to the management team, they went through the same slow bureaucratic processes already. So there was a massive mismatch. So this sort of ties in what I think Andy mentioned earlier in a strange way, is that while certain teams adopted the changes quite well and it worked, other organised areas were forced to adopt it where they didn't actually need to change. But ultimately, the people at the top who should be setting the example and championing it and flag waving out the top of the windows didn't do it at all. So it was actually quite an interesting thing. So with the benefit of hindsight and reflection, one change does not fit all cultures. So different cultures, as I was trying to mention earlier, different cultures have different dynamics. The changes should not have been made compulsory across the organisation. You didn't need if you're already very non-bureaucratic and quick in decision making, you don't need to be told to do it again. The organisation should have looked at the teams that needed to be more, almost like taking something like an impact assessment. And the other teams should have said, if you don't need it, you don't have to take these changes on, because you already fit the culture we want. But should have said to them, but there are options and there's toolkits here and ideas you can use. So basically, with hindsight, it was, I'll say, a mixed success. The second case study, again, is more around a mismatch between two cultures. Again, this is another firm I worked at. It was actually last century, actually. It was such a long time ago. There was a large investment management firm, actually, a large American bank acquired a small UK firm as a part of a corporate takeover. Again, the last firm was a global player. It wasn't the one on the other slide, to be fair, but with many products, it was very profitable, but it was supported by a very large, complex infrastructure. Where the smaller firm, which is the UK organisation that was purchased or acquired by the corporate takeover, was a market leader in the UK, a little bit of business in Europe, but mainly in the UK. But again, it was extremely profitable, very cash rich. But it did admit itself it was very weak in its infrastructure. For example, its website was a bit wobbly. And some of its technology was a little bit out of date. Old versions of Windows as well as old versions of applications. And also some of the controls it had to monitor this was out of date as well. But I think this was stemmed from the fact it had grown from a standing start to a very large market leader in about 6 or 7 years, and it hadn't really. While the growth was expansive, the actual business ecosystem hadn't actually caught up. And as part of the background to the acquisition was that the larger firm, when it acquired the smaller firm would start to use the larger firm's infrastructure. So idea to remove all its technology from its own data center, which I think was in the basement of the firm, as well as the DR center, to the organization, the new parents organization, massive data center, the size of a small football pitch or several small pitches dotted around the US and other parts of the globe. So the impact was there was an absolute. I remember this personally because I was working at this, and it was horrible, to be honest with you. There was a massive cultural mismatch between the larger firm and the smaller firm, or smaller acquired firm. The smaller firm felt the larger firm was slow, bureaucratic, full of politics, and basically jobs worths. They actually resisted the change quite aggressively. I mean, aggressively, verbally aggressively, up to the point they actually decided to ignore the larger firm and and continue on using their own data center, and I've got legal teams as well. And also a number of individuals, not me actually, were so upset about this cultural mismatch and the fact that they just felt the larger firm was dumped on top of them. They actually left the firm. And in fact, one of them actually wrote a letter to a leading newspaper to complain about it, which actually made the front page of the Financial Times. And also the smaller firms competition found it great fun to publish it on their websites. But alternatively, the larger firm felt the smaller firm were arrogant, freewheelers, risk averse, bunch of cowboys. So as you can see, there's a massive, and both points of view is one of these bizarre things. Both points of view are completely correct, but completely different. So with hindsight, and this comes back to the sort of cultural mismatch and having subcultures across organisation, there was a massive mismatch of the culture that caused permanent damage. It should have been managed more tactfully. And therefore, both sides, the smaller firm who was inquired by the larger firm, their management should have spoke to each other before they were jammed or forced together. They need to understand and empathise with each side's point of views and concerns, because again, both points of view are correct, except the complete opposite. They needed to build a migration plan or a mitigation plan, in another way, to integrate with each other. Maybe integrate over a period of time as each person the acquired firm gets to know the larger firm. And to be honest, senior management needed to be more supportive as well as sympathetic. They were very much a case of they were left to their devices, the teams, to get on with it. And I think if management had been a bit more, a combination of sympathetic and forceful, life would have been a lot easier. But this sort of big issues around this too large an acquisition. We have two cultures rammed together, and they just didn't, like two personalities, they're opposite personalities. And again, I was involved in this. It was a very painful learning experience, to be honest with you. Okay, so we've done those case studies. On the wrap up, as I mentioned before, culture is the personality of an organisation, and it's developed or formed over many years, behaviours, myths, history, what have you. Ultimately, it determines, it's like the personality, as I mentioned before. So it basically means if an organisation personality, how things are done, and this then derives the performance of the firm. Organisations, as that case study presents, and also, as I mentioned earlier, will have different subcultures, and some of them will be very different to each other. So you can end up with lots of conflict. Therefore, for you as consultants, or us as consultants, more precise, to implement assignments successfully, you need to understand the culture, and hopefully that long list of checklists I gave you will help with that. Because if you understand the culture, you can manage it, you can plug yourself into it to help you complete assignments successfully. As I mentioned before, managing culture can be hard. And it comes from years of experience and even more years of doing it completely wrong. But if you remember that diagram I mentioned before, you've got internal versus external, hard, soft versus, and the checklist items there. But hopefully that checklist provided a list of various behaviours that can be used to manage the culture. And finally, at the very end, it's possible to change culture, but it needs determination and persistence. But ultimately, it can be done, but not easy, as hopefully we've done. So almost there now. I can see one question, which I'll grab at the end. Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, as enjoyable as I did presenting. I hope you found it useful to listen to. My details are here on the left. Email, website, telephone number, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever that is, handle. So if you've got any questions, feel free to drop me a note or link in with LinkedIn. I'd be delighted to discuss any of the points. Again, obviously, there's a nice picture of me there. It's again many years ago. Also, nothing to do with culture. I've got a number of books out there you may be interested in reading. One's about emerging technology, one's about contracting, one's about change. Therefore, thanks for listening, and I hope you find the talk useful and the hints and tips to make your consulting life a little less stressful. All right.
Thank you, Paul. We have one question from Donna. The question is quite good. So basically, how we can inspire, how we can drive change. We have the approaches top-downs, and maybe that seems to be forced, and we have the approach bottom-up. Yeah. Donna, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the question?
Can you hear me? Because my connection.
Yes.
Yeah, hi, Donna.
So hi, I've been to an employee engagement event recently, and it made me much more aware of the strengths of employees in companies, and having the employees engagement, having employees feedbacks as well is very important for companies, and that can also contribute to change the culture. So I was thinking about how can you get employees involved in that process? So maybe the process can be faster and more sustainable, rather than just an external consultant coming and.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Ash. It's a tricky one. I think you do. I mean, it comes back to the I think diversity and inclusivity point I mentioned earlier. If you're looking to change a culture, you need to change at all levels. Well, obviously, the management needs to support it and drive what the culture is. When you're doing the rolling out the culture, you need champions to implement the culture, case studies, and examples of good behaviour. You need people to be engaged with parts of all organisation, and also from different levels. You need senior people, junior people. If you've got multiple offices, I mean, I think the key thing about a culture, or change generally, remember, change is effectively a social process. Change is triggered by people, implemented by people, and used by people. And the same is for culture. You just need to ensure that all the right people are involved. If you've got somebody who's at the top sort of shouting down, we're going to be more reactive, or we're going to be better customer service, it won't work. You need involvement from everybody in the organisation, from the most senior person to the youngest, juniorest person in the organisation. So. Is that okay, Donna?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Paul.
That's fine. Obviously, if you want to talk about this in more detail, you've got my details. I think they're still on the screen. Feel free to drop me an email. We can. I'm more than welcome to have a chat offline about it. So.
Good. I don't see more questions. We are almost over the top of the hour, so I'm just going to move to thanks again, Paul, to give us this really good session. The session has been quite extensive, and really appreciate it. So, Paul, thank you. Have a nice one.
Okay. Thanks, Antonio. Thanks everybody for your time.